It was a warm summer afternoon, the kind of day when the sun shone just right, making the water in the pool sparkle like tiny diamonds. Laughter echoed from kids splashing, and the gentle hum of conversations filled the air. People lounged in their chairs, some reading books, others scrolling through their phones, all enjoying a peaceful day. Among them was a woman, her skin glowing under the sunlight, relaxed in the water, letting the coolness wash over her. She had been looking forward to this all week, a simple, peaceful swim in the community pool, a place meant for everyone who lived there. She wasn't causing any trouble, wasn't being loud or disruptive. She was simply existing. But not everyone saw it that way. A few feet away, standing stiffly with her arms crossed, a woman watched. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowed. To her, something wasn't right. Something was out of place. And the more she stared, the more her chest tightened with frustration. She took a step closer, then another, her sandals clicking sharply against the pavement. The sound cut through the air like a warning. Some people noticed but quickly looked away. No one wanted to get involved, not yet. The black woman in the pool, unaware of the storm brewing just steps away, floated peacefully, her mind far from any trouble. That was until she heard a sharp voice pierce through the air. "Excuse me." The words hit like a cold slap. She blinked, turning toward the voice. A woman, mid-40s, blonde bob neatly styled, sunglasses perched on her nose, stood by the edge of the pool. Her arms were still crossed, her posture stiff with barely concealed irritation. "Do you live here?" The question wasn't friendly. It wasn't curious. It was accusing. The black woman frowned slightly, confused. "Yeah, I do," she answered simply. Karen, because what else could she be called at this moment? Tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing tighter. "Oh really? Where exactly?" The woman in the pool felt a familiar weight settle in her chest. She knew this game. She had seen it before. She had felt it before. "Over in Building 3, she said, keeping her voice steady. Karen scoffed, shifting her weight. "That's funny. I've never seen you here before." That did it. That sentence. Those words. The black woman sighed internally. Why did it always come to this? Why was her presence always questioned, like she had to prove she belonged in spaces just like everyone else? "Well, I don't come to the pool every day," she replied, keeping her patience in check. Karen's eyebrows lifted, her mouth opening in exaggerated surprise. "Oh, is that so?" Her tone dripped with sarcasm. "Because I've lived here for 10 years and I know everyone who comes to this pool regularly. And I've never seen you." Silence. A few people turned their heads, watching now, waiting. The woman in the pool took a deep breath. She could feel the shift, the way the mood in the air changed. The unspoken challenge in Karen's stance, the way she stood tall, radiating authority she didn't have. "I don't know what to tell you," she finally said, shaking her head. "But I live here and I have every right to be here." Karen let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Oh, I highly doubt that." Her voice had gotten louder now, enough to draw even more attention. A couple sitting under an umbrella whispered to each other. A lifeguard glanced over, hesitating, unsure if he should intervene. "Do you have a key fob?" Karen suddenly asked, her eyes gleaming like she had caught the woman in a lie. The woman in the pool tilted her head. "Do you?" she shot back. Karen's face flushed. "Of course I do. I've had one for years. But I know the people who actually live here. And you? You don't look familiar at all." There it was. That subtle jab, that barely hidden meaning behind the words. The woman in the pool swallowed down the sharp retort that sat on the tip of her tongue. She could feel it creeping in, the anger, the frustration, the exhaustion. She didn't want to do this today. She just wanted to swim. She moved to the edge, gripping the side of the pool as she prepared to pull herself up. But before she could, Karen pulled out her phone. "Well, if you actually live here, you wouldn't mind me calling the office, would you?" Her voice was loud, performative, meant for everyone around to hear. "I mean, we wouldn't want any trespassers using the pool, right?" The woman in the pool sighed, running a hand over her face. "Do whatever you need to do," she muttered, pushing herself up onto the pavement. Karen's fingers moved fast over her phone screen, dialing with the confidence of someone who believed they were in the right. But instead of calling the office, her fingers tapped 3 numbers. 911. People around them stiffened. Some exchanged uneasy glances. A man sitting nearby let out a low curse under his breath. "Yes, I'd like to report a trespasser at the community pool," Karen's voice rang out, clear and sharp. "There's someone here who doesn't live in the neighborhood and they're refusing to leave." The black woman stared at her, disbelief flashing across her face. "Are you serious?" Karen turned slightly, smirking. "Oh, I'm very serious." The The tension in the air thickened. Some people looked down at their phones, pretending not to see. Others looked ready to step in but hesitated. Because what could they really do? The call was already made. And now the waiting began. The heat from the pavement burned under her feet as she stood there, staring at the woman still holding her phone, her lips curled in satisfaction. The black woman clenched her jaw, forcing herself to breathe. She had dealt with situations like this before, too many times to count. But it never got easier. It never felt any less frustrating. People around them shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered, others just watched. The lifeguard, a young man barely out of his teens, looked frozen in place, his eyes darting between them, unsure if he should step in or stay out of it. The air felt heavier now. "Yes, officer, she's still here," Karen said into the phone, glancing at the black woman as if she were some criminal being described on a wanted poster. "I told her she needs to leave, but she's refusing. And honestly, she's getting aggressive." "Aggressive?" The woman blinked, her fingers curling into her palms. Oh. How was standing still, doing nothing but existing, considered aggressive? How was defending her own right to be somewhere suddenly a threat? She could feel the weight of the word settle over her, the way it had been used against people like her so many times before. She knew exactly where this was going. And so did the people watching. A woman sitting under a bright yellow umbrella sighed loudly, shaking her head. "Oh, come on," she muttered, loud enough for Karen to hear but not loud enough to be considered a challenge. Her husband reached for her hand, silently telling her to let it go. But how could anyone let it go? Karen smiled, satisfied as she ended the call. "They'll be here soon," she said, slipping her phone back into her pocket. "We'll see how long you stick around then." The black woman inhaled deeply through her nose, forcing herself to remain calm. Every part of her wanted to yell, to argue, to let loose all the anger bubbling inside her. But she knew better. She knew how this worked. Instead, she crossed her arms. "You know I live here," she said, her voice controlled but firm. "You just don't like that I do." Karen's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "Excuse me?" She let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, please. This has nothing to do with anything but the fact that I've never seen you before, and I don't believe you live here." The woman clenched her teeth. "And why is that?" Karen smirked, tilting her head slightly. "I don't need to explain myself to you." There was again that carefully chosen vagueness, the unspoken words hiding behind polite hostility. Before the woman could respond, the distant sound of sirens cut through the air. People shifted again, some glancing toward the entrance of the pool, others pretending they weren't paying attention at all. The tension wrapped around them like a thick blanket, suffocating. Karen straightened her shoulders, adjusting her sunglasses, her entire body language radiating confidence. To her, this was a victory. She had called, and now the law was coming to handle the problem. The problem being a woman who had done absolutely nothing wrong. A police car rolled up near the entrance, and two officers stepped out, their expressions unreadable behind dark sunglasses. The black woman forced herself to stay still, to keep her breathing even, to remind herself that she had every right to be there. But it didn't matter how many times she told herself that, the familiar knot of anxiety still twisted in her stomach. One of the officers, a tall man with broad shoulders and a stiff posture, approached first. Karen immediately waved him over, stepping toward him with an air of authority that wasn't hers to claim. "Officer, thank God you're here," she said dramatically, pressing a hand to her chest as if she were truly shaken. "I was so uncomfortable. She refused to leave after I asked nicely. I told her this is private property, but she just kept arguing with me. She's making me feel very unsafe." The woman sucked in a slow breath, biting down on the inside of her cheek. "Unsafe?" The officer turned his gaze toward her, looking her up and down, assessing. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "Do you live here?" She met his stare head-on. "Yes." "Do you have proof of residency?" She exhaled sharply. "Of course. Proof." Because her word alone wasn't enough. She reached for her towel, where her phone and ID were tucked away. As she did, she caught the way Karen's lips twitched, almost like she was hoping, praying, she wouldn't be able to prove it. With steady hands, the woman pulled out her driver's license and held it up. "My address is right there," she said firmly. The officer took it, glancing at the ID then back at her. A moment of silence stretched between them. Karen shifted beside him, crossing her arms. "Well, that doesn't prove she's allowed to use the pool," she said, her voice a little sharper now. "You have to be a resident and be up to date on HOA fees. A lot of people sneak in here, and I'm just trying to keep this a safe space for actual residents." The black woman's patience snapped. "You mean people like me?" she asked, her tone pointed. Karen let out a fake gasp, pressing a hand to her chest. Oh my God. I never said that. You're putting words in my mouth. The officer raised a hand, stopping the exchange before it escalated further. He turned to the black woman again. Do you have your pool key fob? She closed her eyes briefly, exhaling. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out the small plastic key and held it up. Silence. Karen's lips parted slightly, her confident stance faltering just a little. The officer took the key, testing it against the pool gate sensor. A loud beep confirmed what should have been obvious from the beginning. She belonged there. Karen's face turned red. Well, The officer turned to her now, his patience clearly running thin. Ma'am, she has every right to be here. His voice had lost its neutrality, now tinged with irritation. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But I was just trying to be cautious. You never know who could be sneaking in. The officer crossed his arms. You called 911 over a resident using the pool. The way he said it, the slight edge of disapproval in his voice, made Karen's face burn with embarrassment. But I didn't know, she insisted. She was acting suspicious. I was just trying to do what exactly? The black woman cut in, her voice calm but razor-sharp. Karen's mouth snapped shut. People were watching more openly now. The whispering had grown louder. The weight of the moment finally settled on her, the realization creeping in. She had lost. She had been so certain the officer would back her up, that her version of events would be accepted without question. But now, standing there with all eyes on her, she could feel the shift. The power she thought she had? Gone. She swallowed, stiffening her shoulders. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Karen stood frozen, her mouth slightly open as if she wanted to say something, but for the first time she had no words. Her confidence, so strong just minutes ago, had cracked. The officer stared at her, waiting. The other officer, who had remained silent until now, shifted slightly, glancing at his partner as if wondering how much longer they had to entertain this nonsense. The black woman, still standing by the pool, arms crossed, watched Karen carefully. She had seen this before, the moment when someone like Karen realized they weren't going to get their way. It was a strange thing to witness. The way their faces twisted, the way they searched for an escape, a way to turn things back in their favor. Karen's fingers twitched as she glanced around, realizing more and more people were watching. Her face burned with something that wasn't quite embarrassment but wasn't quite anger either. It was something in between, something uglier. I was just trying to be careful, she said finally, her voice quieter than before but still carrying that familiar defensive tone. The officer let out a slow breath, clearly losing patience. Ma'am, calling 911 over something like this is a waste of resources. His tone was firm, edged with irritation. Karen's lips parted and for a second she looked genuinely shocked. As if it had never occurred to her that she could be the one in the wrong. But No crime has been committed here, the officer interrupted, his voice sharper now. She has a right to be here. You need to stop harassing her. Harassing. The word landed like a slap and Karen flinched. The black woman didn't move, didn't say anything, but inside she felt something settle. A quiet satisfaction, not because she needed validation from the police, but because, for once, the truth had been spoken aloud. Karen's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. I didn't know, she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. You didn't bother to ask, the black woman shot back, her voice steady but sharp. You assumed. Karen blinked rapidly, her jaw clenching. I was just. You were just what? The woman tilted her head slightly. Making sure people like me don't sneak in? Karen inhaled sharply, shaking her head. That's not what I meant. The officer beside her sighed. Ma'am, you can either leave the pool area or stay and enjoy your day like everyone else. But this conversation is over. For a moment, it looked like Karen was going to argue again, but then she caught sight of the people around her. The way they were watching her now, not with the quiet, unsure glances from before, but with something else. Judgment. Disapproval. Disgust. She was no longer the victim in this story. She was the villain. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She hated this. Hated the way it felt to be on the other side, to be the one people whispered about, to be the one whose actions were questioned. She turned sharply, grabbing her towel from the chair and throwing it over her shoulder. This is ridiculous, she muttered under her breath. I was only trying to help. No one responded. Not even the officer. She huffed, spun on her heel and stalked off toward the exit. The tension she had created didn't disappear with her. It lingered, hanging over the pool like a dark cloud. The black woman let out a slow breath, her hands relaxing at her sides. She turned to the officer still standing there. "Am I free to go now?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. The officer nodded, his face unreadable. "Yes, ma'am." She gave him a tight, knowing smile before turning back to the pool, walking toward her chair. The lifeguard, who had been silent the whole time, finally spoke up. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that," he said quietly. She looked at him, surprised for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah," she said softly. "Me too." A woman from across the pool, the same one who had spoken up earlier, called out, "You handled that better than I ever could." The black woman let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "I'm tired of handling it." The woman nodded in understanding. "I get that." The pool area slowly returned to normal. People went back to their conversations, kids splashed in the water again, and the sun continued shining as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. And everyone there would remember it. She sat back down on her lounge chair, but the air still felt heavy around her. The tension, though fading, clung to the moment like a stubborn shadow. She adjusted her sunglasses, but it didn't matter. She could still feel the eyes on her. Some were sympathetic. Others were uncomfortable. A few looked guilty, like they wished they had spoken up but chose silence instead. The water shimmered under the sun, kids still splashing, laughter bubbling through the air, but she wasn't ready to relax again. Not yet. She glanced toward the pool gate. Karen was gone, but the energy she left behind wasn't. A woman nearby, the one who had defended her earlier, leaned over slightly. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile balance of the moment. She hesitated before answering. "I don't know." Because really, what was she supposed to say? That this was normal? That this was just another day in a life where she constantly had to prove she belonged? That she had grown used to moments like these? She didn't want to say any of that. So instead, she forced a small smile. "I appreciate you speaking up." The woman exhaled, her shoulders sagging a little, as if she had been holding something in. "I wish I did more," she admitted. That made her pause. Because wasn't that the problem? The silence? The hesitation? The way so many people wanted to help but were afraid of making things worse? She could still hear Karen's voice in her head, defensive, angry, refusing to take accountability. "I didn't know. But she should have." That was the real issue, wasn't it? That Karen had never needed to think about this before. That she had the privilege of moving through life without questioning whether she belonged somewhere, without people assuming the worst of her for simply existing in a space. The black woman leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "It's not just about today," she said almost to herself. "It's about all the times this happens and people just let it." The woman beside her nodded, looking down at her hands. "I know." She paused, then sighed. "Or at least, I'm starting to." The admission hung between them, heavy with meaning. Across the pool, a group of teenagers whispered among themselves, stealing glances her way. A few of them looked guilty. One, a girl with dark hair pulled into a high ponytail, suddenly stood up. She hesitated before walking over. Hi," the girl said, shifting awkwardly. She raised an eyebrow, curious but cautious. "Hi." The girl bit her lip, then blurted out, "That lady was crazy." A sharp laugh escaped before she could stop it. "Yeah," she admitted. "She was." The girl shuffled her feet. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I mean, I didn't do anything, but I didn't say anything either, and that doesn't feel right." Something about the honesty in her voice made her chest tighten. She nodded slowly. "Thanks for saying that." The girl looked relieved, like she had been carrying the weight of her silence and needed to put it down. She turned to go but then paused. "My mom always says that the only thing worse than people who do bad stuff is the people who let them." She shrugged. "I think she's right." Then just like that she walked back to her friends. The black woman sat there, watching her go, letting the words sink in. She thought about all the Karens of the world. The people who would rather assume than ask. The ones who thought they had the right to control spaces that were never theirs to control. But she also thought about the people who sat quietly, unsure of how to respond. The ones who wanted to help but hesitated. And the ones who were finally starting to understand. The sun was still shining, the water still sparkling, and the world kept moving forward. She took a deep breath, stretched her legs out, and finally, let herself relax.